discussion on conflict reporting. My name is Raza Rumi, and I'm joined by a really distinguished panel. I'll briefly introduce them, although they need no introduction. Kathy Gannon is with us. She's been a long-time journalist covering Afghanistan for the Associated Press. She's been a bureau chief for them as well. And she's faced personal risks in reporting and bringing out information and stories from Afghanistan. I'm also joined by Rahim Shamsi, who also is a very well-known broadcast and print journalist. She's worked for various media outlets. Her last assignment was with Sama TV in Pakistan. Prior to that, she's been with the BBC, Dawn, and many other media outlets. And we're also pleased that Asad Hashim has joined us, who works for Al Jazeera and is their correspondent in Pakistan. But he has also worked both in Pakistan and with foreign outlets covering peace and conflict. And that is the theme of our discussion this afternoon. Conflict reporting and crisis reporting, as they say, is now something that is not just a challenge for journalists, but I think it has also become a major issue when it comes to the relationship of state and civil society, state and journalists, state and local politics. And I think we are trying to, in this session, bring out some of the challenges that many journalists face across South Asian region while they cover conflict zones and areas which have been hit by violence or even local hostilities. So I'll start with you, Kathy, given that your experience with Afghanistan and Pakistan all these years. Tell us about your experience of conflict reporting and what kind of challenges have you faced and what challenges still remain, particularly when covering Afghanistan and by extension Pakistan as well.
Thanks very much. Huge topic, the whole what's involved in conflict reporting. I think if you divide it down into just reporting and then doing it in that environment, I think reporting, regardless of where you're doing it and in what environment, is all the same principles in terms of really trying to go out and talk to people, do your stories face to face if you can, going into the environment so that you can feel what people are feeling, and so you can get a better sense, and establishing your sources that you can trust, people that you can trust and that can trust you. So I think reporting, whether you're doing it in conflict or whether you're doing it anywhere in the world, and there are different dangers to reporting in different stories that you're doing. Even if you're doing a flooding story, there's dangers involved, and so I think reporting as such for me is regardless of where you're doing it, the principles are very much the same. In a conflict, it's the difficulties is being able to reach the people and the stories you want to do, and finding out a way to get beyond your office, but also to find a way to perhaps not embed with militaries, which has been a difficulty in muddying the waters, I think, for many of us in conflict areas. And I understand why organizations do it, and it certainly, one does it, another. So there is that. So it's not that I say I don't understand it, but it has muddied the waters very much, I think, for us as journalists in conflict areas. We went out to report on the elections in Afghanistan in 2014, because for me it was always very important, and it still is very important, to get out into the field and to try to tell the stories from there, rather than to just make phone calls or to do it from within the main centers. And that's when there was a shooting, and my friend and colleague was killed in an eating house, and I was hit with 7 bullets and was quite seriously injured. And people say, well, why do you continue to do it? And what did you do right? What did you do wrong? Not often do they say, what did you do right, frankly, but anyway, what we really did do is we really did do everything right. We did everything possible to mitigate the dangers, because really that's your role in your job, is to do everything possible to mitigate the dangers. We ensured that we went with people we trusted. We were in an area that, in fact, was a police compound when it happened. We had checked with the UN, who had been on that road. We had checked with many, many different organizations, and we had done our homework very, very well. But you can't eradicate dangers, and you can't eradicate risks. So you have to do the best you can, in my mind, to mitigate them. And when you think that it's possible and you've done the best you can, then we try to go out and do that so that we can tell the stories. I think one of the things that's happened is fewer stories are from the field. There's so many reports that are just whatever the government says, whatever the opposition says, whatever the Taliban says, whatever, and it's become increasingly difficult to go and verify and to challenge and to report. Al Jazeera, however, does a remarkable job on going into these areas and getting those deep stories. And we try, AP does some amazing work as well, and we try our best to get into these areas and do these stories. But I do feel that the waters have become muddied, so that the participants don't see us quite as neutral as they have and they should. Part of that is our fault as journalists and how we've done our job in some ways, and part is that the difficulties of the situation. So that's sort of in a really gigantic nutshell where I stand on the whole conflict reporting.
Thank you, Kathy. That was a great opening for our discussion in this hour. Amber, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but in the context of Pakistan, and in particular the hazards of journalists covering, conflict areas such as the former FATA or the tribal districts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or even parts of Balochistan, or wherever there are situations of conflict, and how difficult it gets there, and at the same time how important it is for the mainstream to know what is going on there, and because that not just informs the public but also shapes the necessary public opinion for policy shifts. You muted, Amber, so.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this fantastic panel. I think Kathy really set it up really beautifully, because I will say one thing, that as journalists and as a journalist based as I have been in Islamabad, and I was privileged because I was traveling to a conflict zone. I didn't live in a conflict zone. If there's a big difference, and one of the ways that we used to do this is that we would prepare ourselves, as Kathy said. We would talk to local journalists, local community activists, for instance, stakeholders, parties who are involved in that conflict, and find a way to ensure that the team was as possible. But you have to understand that the journalists or freelance or conflict areas to help us get a better understanding of the layout of the land and who the players are, they actually live in those conflict zones and the peripheries. As you spoke about, Balochistan, for instance, along the line of control, Kashmir, or former FATA. These are areas where there are journalists who do their work in incredibly difficult circumstances without the support of larger media organizations, particularly ones based, for instance, Al Jazeera or AP or AFP or Reuters or whatever. They will work for numerous media organizations and channels and won't have that kind of support. So, I mean, full sympathies. I think we must recognize the privilege that journalists who fly out to conflict zones have. Having said, at the same time, I will say that one of the things that we do before we go to any kind of conflict zone is obviously ensure that we have all the voices, and in particular focus on those voices that you may not hear in the mainstream. Minorities, women, children, the most vulnerable. These are not the kind of voices that you get to hear in the mainstream. You tend to hear a lot of officials. You tend to hear leaders of political parties or groups. But it is actually the people affected by that conflict whose voices I think that's really important that we bring to the fore, so that if a policy is formed around it, or if we can help people understand the human cost of that conflict. So these are some of the things I think that we must bear in mind. And I would like to really reiterate the fact of our privilege.
Sorry. Thank you, Amber. That was really insightful. And I'll go to Asad. Asad, Kathy also mentioned Al Jazeera's work, and and you have personal experience of covering a lot of these areas, and so I'd like to focus a little bit on how states sort of view journalists and how they view their work, and how they are sometimes threatened or insecure about what kind of reporting comes in, and not just in Pakistan, but across South Asia. If we look at the region as a whole, we have a huge issue with that. I mean, they basically want the state's narrative or state's position on a particular conflict zone to get out, and nothing alternative or nothing that counters that. So your thoughts about that, and then we'll move on to other topics. Asad, you're muted, so yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on this panel as well. I'm in very exalted company and quite pleased to be here. I think Kathy covered the approach to conflict journalism perfectly. That's why we do it, and that's the way we need to do it. It's important to remain focused on the idea of, like, there's a reason why we need to continue to go out to those areas rather than staying behind the bunker walls and kind of reporting on the phone. You can still do the job that way, but there is an importance to engaging with communities who are actually affected by the violence. So it's not, exactly as Kathy said, that the waters get muddied when you start doing embeds with one side or the other, and then you start being seen in a certain way. And the way to combat that for journalists, I think, and this is something Kathy has done extremely well in her work in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, I can say, as a reader of her work for many years, is you build trust with communities, you build relationships with the people who you're covering, and over time and over the years, they will then trust you to actually tell their stories, and tell stories that they would perhaps not be telling to anyone else, because it is a contested narrative. Conflicts, what they do is, in journalism, in all journalism, there's always two or multiple sides of a story, and everyone is contesting to make their side of the story the dominant one. But in a conflict, it sharpens that quite a lot, because obviously lives are on the line on both sides. And I think governments do everything that they can to try and control those narratives, and states do, as much as other warring parties. And I think that, to segue into kind of the state of conflict journalism in Pakistan today, I would say, I would say there's very limited actual conflict journalism actually happening in Pakistan at the moment. There are active military operations in Balochistan. There are active military operations in parts of the tribal districts. We're not seeing those. All the reporting that we see on those is anything that the state puts out. We're not even seeing the other side statements on these issues of what's happening. So and we're definitely not seeing on the ground reportage of from reporters and local journalists. And this is not to say that the local journalists are not there. There are journalists in every tehsil and district of this country reporting on everything that is happening, or able to report on everything that is happening, but they are stopped from doing so. And that's where the state comes in, and that's where the state essentially takes a very, very heavy hand in Pakistan and in other countries as well, for the reasons that I mentioned, because they want to control the narrative, and they want to control the way that the conflict is seen, and in fact, the extent to which the conflict is seen at all. So people, they can control whether people are even aware if there's a military operation going on in Avaran or Makran districts and so on. I think the other side of this, given that there is not a lot of actual active conflict journalism happening in Pakistan, is how risks don't dissipate. And so there's a different profile to conflict journalism in Pakistan right now, which is a state that's antithetical to the idea of critical journalism. This is not a new thing. I'm not pointing fingers at one government or another. I think Pakistan state has always been quite opposed to the idea of a free press and of a critical press, no matter who's been in charge. But we're going through a particularly difficult period right now. And one of the reasons for that is because the state's power is largely unchallenged. And they are able to, I mean, we at this point are seeing reporters get picked up for stories that they've done and then mysteriously reappear a few days later, and no one really knows what's happened to them. And even if reporters do talk to them, as I'm sure Kathy has done and I have done, everything is, nothing comes out into the public because they're not willing to, and for good reason, because there's not only a direct but a demonstrated risk to their safety. So what the atmosphere that we're in right now in Pakistan, I would say, is like the theater of conflict has in fact opened up to almost every issue in Pakistan. If you're doing critical journalism on anything, whether it's politics, whether it's national security, whether it's the accountability process, virtually anything can put you in trouble. And so what Kathy started with, this idea of you prepare to try and mitigate the risks as much as possible, I think that's something that Pakistani journalists now need to do, looking at a wider array of stories, not just if they're planning a reporting trip to South Waziristan. They need to do that for almost every story that they do now, if it's on a critical issue.
Yes, mitigation and mitigating risks, absolutely, Asad, well said. And I will come back to some of the themes that you and Amber picked up, but I just wanted to quickly talk about, I mean, perhaps the most alarming area there where we see some of these issues with the state. I mean, is perhaps at least in the recent past, the Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir, where we have seen, from a physical, virtual clampdown on any kind of information for months and months, and now it's gradually opening up, but it's still, we don't know much. We don't get enough of stories, and perhaps I'd like your comment on that, all of you, all three of you, and that does that exemplify a state's particular response to a local zone of conflict, or is it a larger part of the political process as it is unfolding in India? So a very quick comment. Maybe Amber, you can say something on that, and then I'll go on to Kathy and then Asad.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that the state, obviously, in every, in particularly countries such as India or Pakistan, want to control the narrative, and more so when it comes to a conflict, because there are international ramifications, there are legal ramifications, there's a wariness of allowing a spotlight to turn on a particular issue. What I've seen is, I think technology has perhaps helped, and I've seen the determination of journalists from Kashmir who have actually risked their lives to smuggle out, materials. Written material has been even just an online report, using various ways to get it out there to the public, to the international media as well. So because we know how the Indian press's media has been operating. So I think that it's a deliberate attempt to control the narrative. It's obviously has a political. It's for political reasons, and I think it really underlines the fact you see, what happens in a conflict zone is that if the stories of those who are marginalized, those against those victims of violence, if they're not told, their grievances actually increase, and that's what we've seen as well. Indian-held Kashmir as well. It adds to the sense of deprivation. It adds to the sense of victimhood. It adds to the anger against the state. So it's really ultimately always counterproductive.
Yeah, Amber, thank you for that. Kathy, may I get your quick comment on that? I mean, is it just controlling the narrative or something more insidious?
I think in terms of controlling the narrative, I think it's done in many ways in many countries. I think Amber is very right in terms of it being counterproductive. But I think also the Kashmiri journalists that have done some really great work. There have been a lot of stories out of Kashmir, quite honestly. some great ones. Our photographers won a Pulitzer for all their Kashmir photography. It was brilliant. There's been some really remarkable and very moving stories. And yet it hasn't impacted much the way there's been some quite remarkable reporting out of Xinjiang and the Uyghur clampdown and the camps. So I think there has been quite significant reporting out of Kashmir and Indian operated Kashmir. And many of it by journalists who've been remarkable. That doesn't negate the state's clampdown or attempts to clamp down. But I think there really has been quite remarkable. I think the question maybe is, why is it not being heard? Why is it not having an impact? Why is it is the response to these stories, depending on the nation it comes from, because of their economic power, because of their regional power, so I'm not as convinced that those great, really good, strong stories haven't been told, because I think a lot has been written, quite honestly.
Yes, Asad,
Yeah.
maybe you can weigh on this one.
I kind of find myself in between both of my fellow panelists on this one. On the one hand, I think the clampdown that India was able to put on to Indian administered Kashmir, especially after August last year, was kind of the dream of any state that wants to control a narrative. They were able to essentially shut down an entire region and blockade it. And in some ways, I mean, shut down the internet for many months. And as Amber was saying, you had to smuggle out. I mean, I've heard stories from colleagues who were smuggling out news copy written down on pieces of paper that they were hiding on their person. They weren't even able to get out things like digital cards and so on. And so, yes, absolutely, the AP team that got out those photos, they won the Pulitzer as much for the brilliance of the photos as for also the tenacity and the determination to get the story out. I do also agree with what Kathy says, is that if you look at it now in the ultimate analysis about a little bit more than a year later, there were stories that got out. And even before that, if we cut back to 2016, the stories of the pellet shootings and after Burhan Wani, those stories they were finding a way to get out. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is because communities want their stories to be told. As Amber pointed out, this is something that there is a push for, and you cannot completely, especially not in today's age, it's extremely difficult to completely silence a community. And I think, and it's important for those stories to be told. I think there's a push for that. One thing that I'm a little concerned about, I think Kathy has alluded to this, is exactly why have these stories not made the impact that one would think that they would make? And I think a lot of that has to do with the political economy of the region. I think a lot of that also has to do with, and I tend to think of this sometimes anthropologically as well, it has to do with the way that audiences imagine different parts of the world. And many audiences don't imagine India as a perpetrator of this kind of violence. And again, I'm not pointing the finger just at India. I think they imagine some countries as being perpetrators of this kind of violence, and they imagine others as just, not necessarily being that way. So, for example, it's easy to tell a story about violence in Afghanistan, whereas it may be more difficult to tell a story about violence in India. This plays into, and then this creates kind of problems, I find, with editors sometimes, because editors, it's a fine balance, and good editors will be able to walk that line of, no, the audience needs to know this even if they're not interested in hearing it. And I think I've seen it happen both ways, and I've dealt with editors over the years in my career, when I was a freelancer dealing with lots of different publications, where, they sometimes just don't want to hear a certain story, and they want to hear a similar story that's actually of less news value, but just because it fits a certain rubric. Now, that's to do with the way that we imagine different parts of the world, and I wonder how that changes. But the way I view my role as a journalist, and I think of all journalists, is our job is just to keep telling the stories and just to keep hitting on those notes. And the impact that it makes is, the moment I start thinking about what impact is my story going to make, I feel like that's me going down the wrong road. I need to look at what story is, whether it's important enough to be told, and to make sure that it is told. What impact it makes, that's to be discussed and to be figured out, after the fact.
Thank you, Asad. I think I agree with you on all your points. But I think the reason I picked up this particular example was not just to spotlight one country or one region, but I think it is very illustrative of how the various states in South Asia, which are kind of inheritors of the British colonial apparatus, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, by extension, and how this idea of repressive environment for reporting and journalism is directly linked to democracy and democratization and the potential for long-term peace. And that's where what I want to discuss next is the India-Pakistan context. And just for the viewers, the JI did reach out to Indian journalists, but sadly we could not get anyone on the panel because we wanted to hear from them as well. So, I mean, there's been talk about there's a whole debate on peace journalism, as you all know. So, where journalists are viewed as these ambassadors or harbingers of peace, and they can build peace both at the local and the national and the regional level. I mean, I don't know. It's an ongoing, lots of pro and con sort of debate. Still underway. So in that context, I mean, give me a quick thought on the notion of peace journalism, and then my specific question, and maybe I'll start with you, Amber, on this one, is how in the context of India-Pakistan, because both Amber, Rahim Shamsi and Asad Hashim are involved in the Jinnah Institute's, track to diplomacy, to build bridges and better understanding between India and Pakistan. So how do you view that, and what role can journalism play in an intractable and complex conflict such as that of India and Pakistan?
Mhm. All right. I mean, these are two very heavy questions. I'll try to answer the one about peace journalism first. So, if we understand journalism to be a form of conflict resolution, not really. I mean, I think our job as journalists is really to talk to all sides of the story, even if there are multiple sides, and especially I keep emphasizing this, bringing in voices that perhaps may not have been heard. So essentially a better understanding of what the conflict is, who is involved, and how people are affected. It's pretty much as simple as that. I mean, I remember the example of when the Lal Masjid episode was happening in Islamabad, and there was a particular famous anchor who was trying to on live television trying to sort of broker peace between both sides of the conflict. I mean, it really brings to question: is that our job, and are we equipped to do that? And should we be doing that? Even if we're trying to work as interlocutors, I think our job is to deliver information, is to shine a spotlight, really. So so I'm not sure if I would be very comfortable or personally happy calling it that. I mean, it is, in a sense, it is a form of conflict resolution, but would I actively take on that role of peace journalism? Perhaps not. Perhaps I wouldn't be comfortable with it. On the other question of being involved in track 2 dialogue between India and Pakistan, so I've been involved for a couple of years, and I think it's given me an opportunity to talk to Indian journalists and politicians, who actually I would not have been able to meet otherwise, because as you know very well know, getting a visa to India or getting a visa to Pakistan is incredibly hard. There were multiple forums and exchanges that used to happen. So that interaction, that understanding of each other and problems that are often common and shared. For instance, I mean, the smog season is on at the moment. Delhi and Lahore are equally affected. In India, they're dealing with their own Hindutva and right-wing party. We're dealing with right-wing parties here, intolerance. I mean, there's a lot to understand and share. So I see myself as being involved in the track 2 as really just basically developing a better understanding of their side of the story, building bridges, as you said as well, and making contacts. I think it's been very useful in terms of exchanging story ideas or just sharing platforms as well.
Right. Asad, you want to add to what Amber has said?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, yeah, I'm also a little bit old-fashioned when it comes to this idea of peace journalism. I don't see journalists as, and I don't think that they should be sort of actors for conflict resolution. I think that their work can be an input into that process, perhaps. But I don't think that that's something that they should be doing, and I definitely don't think that's something that they should be seeing themselves as. Our job, as Amber and Kathy have both said, is to tell the story as fully as possible and from every side as possible, and also not to reduce it down to binaries as often often people try to imagine it or think about it. So it's not always just good and bad, the right side and the wrong side. It's also not always just two sides in a conflict. First of all, there's always three sides in conflict. There's the two warring sides, and there's the people in the middle who are actually the communities on whose land that war is being fought. And in addition to that, then there's always a multifaceted number of different places. And so we need to tell all of those stories. And I think, like I said, I think stories that we tell can be an input into the peace process, perhaps in giving much more information to audiences and perhaps to policymakers about what's actually going on out there. But I don't see myself as a peacemaker, for example, when I go into reporting a conflict. I think the other side of that is, and something that I found in my work, that this idea of binaries is something that I found happening more and more as narratives are more and more controlled, and as conflict journalism in its truest form is clamped down on more and more. You find it's very easy for one side to demonize the other on whatever the axis of the conflict might be. And so I think something that I've tried to do with my work for a long time, and particularly actually in the blasphemy, on the issue of blasphemy, which I've been covering for many years, is, I've seen that it's very easy for people to paint people who call for violence in the name of the blasphemy laws as somehow irrational or somehow backward or somehow insane or just evil people or bad people. And just as easy on the other side is for them to see people who are calling for reform of the blasphemy laws as, Western minded or somehow different. And something I've tried to do a lot is, try to explain the thought processes and the political economy that leads to these people having these positions. All people are humans, and it's not. In my experience, very few people take a truly irrational position. Very few people take a position that makes absolutely no sense. There's a reason for them to conceive of their world in that way, and that's because they look at their world in that way. That's why they perhaps espouse violence in certain ways, shapes, or forms. So something that I've been particularly interested in over the years is the idea of what drives humans to take up violence of any kind, whether it's against another a single person, or whether it's taking up arms against a state or another group. And I think that can maybe inject into the peace process in some way, of at least increasing an understanding of, well, what's the actual driver of this conflict? They're not just bad people. Not everybody's just bad people. And on the track 2 stuff, again, I very much look at it the same way that Amber does. I've been a part of it once a couple of years ago, and I continue to be a part of it even now. And it's something that, because I feel, especially in the India-Pakistan context, the media markets are so completely separated. The realities are almost, it's like black and white. So, India says something is black and Pakistan says something is white, and 220 million people here believe that it's white, and 1 billion people here believe that it's black, and that's it. There's no interchange, there's no information sharing at all. And so something that I find particularly useful is there's almost like there's a brick wall, iron curtain between the two countries, and having things like this track 2 are very useful to try and understand. As I was outlining for what I do in my other work, it's very useful to understand, well, what's the point of view on these things, because there must be another point of view and it can't be irrational. So it's useful, very, very useful that way, I find.
Thank you, Asad.
Before you go on to Kathy, I just like to say something, especially about peace journalism and conflict resolution. I think one important aspect that we're also missing out is that the media and journalism also provides a kind of sort of so anger and resentment, these all become like pressure cookers, and we kind of provide a valve. Where people who are affected, who are angry, who have something to say, they can let off steam. And in that sense, I think I find every time, in fact, for instance, if we giving an example, Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan has held several protests in Islamabad since 2017. And every time that I've gone there to ask some questions and to get their point of view, their anger has stemmed from the fact that they haven't been allowed to speak their piece on the mainstream media. And that's when they become hostile to journalists as well, not just the state and perhaps their point of view. So I think that plays a slight role. Just the fact that if people who have a grievance, people who are angry, if they're able to let off steam a little, the media can provide that platform or forum.
Thank you, Amber. I'll pick on the themes that you and Asad highlighted, because I think that's going to be our next sort of phase of this conversation. But I come to you, Kathy, and both the ideas of peace journalism, because they were very much advanced, if I remember, in the context of Afghanistan, when there was a presidential election and there was this whole thing about how positive reporting and journalists are ambassadors of peace. I used to read these odd pieces. So perhaps you can talk a bit about peace journalism, as well as its, if at all, its relevance in Afghanistan's internal and regional conflict situation?
Well, first, I don't know what peace journalism is. I mean, you know, journalism is journalism. I don't think there's peace journalism, conflict journalism. I'm really old-fashioned, and so I'm even, you know. So for me, there's just journalism. There's no such thing as peace journalism or even conflict journalism. I mean, you know, there's ways of doing your reporting, and as Amber said, it's about going out and giving a voice to so many different facets and people and different communities that don't have a voice. I think our greatest role is in getting the information out, telling the stories that of the people affected. And if people are ready to listen and willing to listen, I think it then informs the situation, and depending on how it's presented, does it have a great impact? And when you tell the stories of people who are suffering, it often has quite a remarkable impact. You know, we did some stories that really I was amazed at the impact. And as you said, Asad, so rightly, is about why people do it, you know, and to tell everybody's stories, not to dismiss somebody as, well, they're, you know, crazy, or they think this way. And you know, I remember interviewing the brother who killed his sister when I did this series in honor killings. And you know, people said, well, you know, but even my editor said it was really interesting because you understood, you know, he was going on about how people were making fun of him and making, I mean, nothing was justifying, of course, what happened. But there was a way to say that, wait a minute, you know, I mean, we all kind of have some part of this in us. And so it makes it easier to relate. When the stabbing in France over, you know, I went to the village and we did a story looking at the village and at where the young lad then went to live in France from our bureau there. And so people got a better understanding. And I think this is what we do when we do our jobs. And that's our job, is to do these stories. We're not peacemakers, and we're not conflict resolution people. I couldn't resolve a conflict if my life depended on it, you know, and that's not what I do, you know, and that's not what we do. But I understand this India, Pakistan being able to, you know, to have that communication with Indian journalists, and, you know, and I know they as well are so pleased to be able to have some interaction with Pakistani journalists, because it's a, you know, to be able to share that. But I just don't think any of us are peace journalists, and I'm certainly not.
Okay, that was a very emphatic confession, Kathy. But I just want to go back to some of the points that Asad made in the context of India and Pakistan, in particular the two media markets. And I mean, you know, I've been sort of writing about it as well. That I mean, I think that, and this is my view, and please disagree and trash it, is that I think the corporate media, or what we call the mainstream media, the way it is shaped up in both India and Pakistan, especially after deregulation, etc., I think it's turning into a kind of a driver of conflict. I mean, if you look at the most recent events of the Pulwama attack, the later you know, skirmishes between India and Pakistan, and the kind of hysteria and the kind of jingoism that media drummed up. I mean, you know, it's one thing for the states to do that, and then when the states and media align, and that goes back to our very first point that we were talking about, and how that states try to control the narrative. But you know, they control the narrative that, you know, the narrative is amplified 100 times on big TV channels and screens. And I think, of course, that has to do with media ownership: who owns the media, who runs it, what are the editorial filters or not. But I think that is something that I would like you all to talk a bit about, because I think in the South Asian context, I mean, you know, we would have to address this issue. And sadly, it's not anything under the control of the government directly. I mean, they have influence, they have levers of influence, but, you know, it has to do with the industry itself. I mean, and in particular also, I wanted to keep it separate, but I'll add, disinformation or fake news. I mean, because when you add these two together, as was happening, I mean, I think most recently the Indian channels were reporting on some kind of a quote unquote civil war in Karachi. I mean, that was most outlandish for a 48 hours news cycle of world's supposed largest democracy, and I'm not solely blaming India, because a lot of it also happens in Pakistan, and now with the rise of digital technologies, it also happens on YouTube or YouTube broadcasts. So I want to get your quick comments on that, and then I want to get onto the digital spaces, because they are presenting another arena of hostility and conflict, and that we should address a bit separately. So on India and Pakistan corporate media, jingoism, Asad.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I mean, I think that. So an interesting marker to put down there, I think, for that conversation is the difference between you've used the correct word there. You've been talking about media and not journalism, because what that is not journalism. What that is a form of propaganda and a form of audience making and a form of marketing. If you really want to abstract it out, it's all of that, and trying to capture those markets and trying to capture those emotions. Again, something that I find very interesting in the practice of journalism is understanding how people don't really care about empiricism and truth. People care about what makes them feel good, usually, in my experience. And I think a lot of those things basically speak to those levers within their audiences. What I find particularly interesting about that, so that's not journalism, that's media, and that's media organizations acting in certain ways, often, if not explicitly, encouraged by the state to do so. And that's the same that you see in Pakistan as you see in India. And as I was mentioning earlier, that leads to situations such as when you have that kind of iron curtain between the markets. You have a situation where everybody on Indian media is talking about a civil war in Karachi, which was just completely insane and so far from the truth that it was not even possible. And obviously that was not the case. And exactly similar things happen in the Pakistani markets as well. Maybe we don't have an example that comes immediately to mind because it hasn't happened recently, but it can happen because it's set up in this way. I think, Raza, you've let states off the hook a bit with your formulation of the problem. I think states explicitly want this to be the case. They want to be able to have the division of truth so that they can have their truth, which they control, and they explicitly encourage through both. Let's say through both legal and illegal coercion of news organizations to get them to report on things in certain ways, and to whip up that kind of fervor and to whip up that kind of jingoism and nationalism. What I find particularly interesting is the implication of that, which is when the tail wags the dog. Because once you do that, you're not always in control of what happens next. And that's, I think, something that I find interesting. I'd be really, really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about it too.
Right. Amber, you want to go next?
Yeah, yeah, I think, so building on from there, we talked about how conflicts should be covered as journalists, which is including all the important voices and sides that are involved in the conflict. The reason that, Raza, as you pointed out, the Indian media, the Pakistani media, the kind of jingoism and that you see on both sides of the border, and I think I would absolutely say, given the Karachi the Karachi coup or whatever that was, is one extreme example. The reason that it fuels conflict is because you only see one side. It's as simple as that. And I'll say, just back in 2016, up until back in 2016, when I was hosting a show on another channel, a Pakistani channel, I could actually include Indian commentators. I could include Indian students in my shows. And the whole idea was, actually, what I was trying to do at the time was to include all the voices in the conflict, as it should be, as I had been trained as a journalist, except it doesn't work that way. And I can again say, as somebody who's worked in the mainstream media now for around 4 years, that the state actively encourages, there is now actually a restriction on Indian voices in mainstream media. So you can't do that anymore. You can't do better journalism than the kind of journalism that you see across the border in India. And we get specific instructions on how to cover a particular story, hints, notes, you could say, advice. So I think that while the Pakistani media is perhaps not as Bollywoodized, so it's not as disco as the Indian media is, it is actually absolutely has become a propaganda tool of the government's position between India and Pakistan and Kashmir.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Kathy, may your comments on that? I mean,
Yeah, I agree with both. I mean, they said it all. I think one of the things though that Asad said is about marketing and about this hysteria to generate, and we're talking television, I mean, because it's, and television journalism needs a huge overhaul everywhere, I think, in terms of how it's done and how it's presented and it's whether it's hysteria in India-Pakistan context, whether it's a hysteria in the American context. I think that it is, in a way, very much a television phenomena and television media phenomena. And so I think there's some real need to look very seriously at the whole television broadcasting in terms of ethics and how they do it and how, that you train journalists how to do journalism, but yet you go on television and it's not, and as you said, Asad, it's not journalism, it's media, but therein lies the blurring of the lines, and we're all impacted by it because we're all seen as being the same, painted by the same brush. So I think we all have a stake in this, and yes, you're absolutely right in terms of the hysteria in the Pakistan and Indian media, but it's not just limited to these two countries, and I think that's really something that needs some real serious examination in the whole field of journalism is that we look at it, because we are impacted as journalists, even though, as you say, that's media, but we are impacted.
yeah, absolutely, and you're right, Kathy. It's not just limited to our region, but I mean, in the US, for example, I mean, cable TV is a nuisance. I mean, far more than a nuisance now. It's insidious and dangerous. But anyway, Amber, I want to shift to the so we talked about conflict and threats and crises and the role of state, but I also want to talk about the digital spaces and the online spaces, which have become these avenues of hostility and attacks and women journalists in Pakistan, in India as well, and in other parts of the world have been sort of the immediate targets of these hostile campaigns, and not always by states either. I mean, let's be fair. I mean, of course, sometimes there are sort of state-sponsored troll farms, but on the other hand, there are also lots of other people who think it's kind of cool or acceptable to perpetuate that kind of harassment. So I would like you to talk a bit about that, and particularly in your personal context as well, because you've been at the receiving end, unfortunately.
Yes, so I think when we talk about conflict journalism and conflict reporting, we were able to differentiate, and Asad did that, between when you go into a physically violent conflict and just the hostile reporting environment, so working in that. I think it's also very similar in terms of online spaces where your work as a journalist is the threats that you face, the hostility that you face is reflected in online spaces as well. And then there's a potential for it to spill offline. So, I was part of a group of women who issued a statement this August talking about what seemed to be coordinated campaigns against particularly women journalists, the kind of language that was used, very sexualized. And that's what happens, really. So women journalists aren't just targeted for their alleged yellow journalism, being paid to do propaganda for a particular political party, but also just rape threats, for instance, really disgusting sexual abuse. And this seemed to be, and because these are coordinated campaigns led by various groups, they did seem to be deliberate. Which is why a group of us got together and issued a statement this August, raising our voice against it. And we asked the government in power, which we believe is the most responsible at this point, to take action, which was at the time was, for instance, calling in the Senate and National Assembly Human Rights Committees. The Human Rights Minister had promised the safety of journalists as well. It is her responsibility. So we'd also flagged her in that particular statement as well. And the idea really was to take the conversation where all political parties, and I would like to point out that all the women who signed on to that particular statement weren't just being targeted by one political party. So at this moment in time, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which is actually sort of has taken the lead in terms of digital politics, perhaps leans the attacks seem to come the most from there. But several of us have faced attacks from other political parties and including religious organizations. So the idea really was to bring that to attention, because what it does is it being a woman journalist is hard enough in Pakistan. You really have to sort of overcome multiple hurdles in order to get to a certain space or a place where your voice matters. And when that happens, and then you are abused online, and there's a deliberate undermining of your credibility, and powerful groups are trying to push, not just undermine your credibility, but probably try to silence you as well. Something is deeply wrong. I think a lot of journalists have come to accept this as a part of their job, and you were told, well, no, just grow a thicker skin, ignore. I don't think it is acceptable, because this is online harassment and online violence. Again, I would like to point out there are multiple examples in India and in Pakistan where they're spilled offline as well. It really is... it affects freedom of speech. There are many women journalists who, out of fear of reaction from their families, from their media organizations, prefer not to speak just because of the sort of massive trolling campaigns that attack them. And we have to bear in mind that it is not a journalist's job to respond to every troll. And there is a deep sort of imbalance in terms of power. So it's one journalist against many. And because these are coordinated campaigns, it is a weaker person who is in a weaker position against the many who are in a more powerful position. So I know that this is a global conversation. This is not just one that was had in Pakistan. This is a conversation that's happening globally. In the UK, in the US, where how to deal with online trolls is actually now, these are courses being taught by journalism organizations. This was the UN took this up. Multiple rights groups have taken it up. So this is a serious issue that needs much more attention. It should not be dismissed.
Yes, thank you, Asad. You want to add to what Amber said?
I mean, I think Amber's pretty much covered and covered the significance of it as well. And I think one of the things that she said that's particularly, I think, if the audience is going to take one thing away from this, take this, is that, it's not enough to just say, oh, grow a thicker skin, you're a journalist, it's fine, you're supposed to be able to deal with this. These things have very real ramifications, and we're not just talking about people's mental health. Exactly as Amber says, these things do spill over into real world attacks sometimes, and it is a form of intimidation against particular points of view, and it is a form of suppression of freedom of speech, particularly for women journalists who are already in any newsroom in Pakistan. At the very least, I think it's easy to say that they're far more vulnerable than their male colleagues. And what I would say is that male colleagues and male journalists have a role to play in this as well, and that role is to recognize that there is a difference between what they receive and what their female colleagues receive. There is a difference in the effect that it has and the nature of it. And it's not enough to simply say grow thicker skin, because something that I think has guided my kind of decision making throughout my career as a journalist. I've been doing this for about 13 years now, and something that I've realized over the years. And when I was younger, I didn't realize this, but I learned from my female colleagues that if I've had to work extremely hard to get to where I am. They've probably had to work at least 10 times harder for every single thing, in every meeting, in every editorial discussion, in every space that they go into, in every press conference, trying to find a space for them to even be able to set themselves up. So this is something, there is an imbalance in this. And so just because male journalists have worked hard, it doesn't mean that our female colleagues should just deal with it the way that men do. I mean, we get abuse online too, but it is fundamentally different, in my opinion. Raza, I think you're muted.
My apologies. Yeah, I turn to you, Kathy, now. So basically, Amber and Asad have both highlighted the problems with reference to how women journalists are facing all these attacks online and the spill over into offline. So I'd like you to weigh in on that as well as on the larger beast called the social media.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Amber and Asad said. I mean, and I also think that we have to be proactive in terms of this is these are threats that are made. It's not you legally you shouldn't have the right to make these threats. And whether you make it and Amber's right, of course, the threats that come or the language is more sexual, more and very ugly and vicious. But I think there has to be more involvement of trying to legally deal with this. Organizations do, and there are some advocacy groups that do. But I think it's a real issue that some innovative thinking has to be really put out there to try to come up with it. There's a lot of people being able to understand where it's coming from, but these are threats, and they can result in physical harm. And so I think there's that, and I've received many and from many different people, and I don't think you just deal with it. I think you report it. I think you don't answer the trolls, but I do think when it's a danger.
I think we're having a bit of a connectivity issue. So I'll quickly go. There's so many questions I have and so many themes that we can explore. When it comes to both crisis and conflict and the relationship of journalism with them. So I just want to quickly, Asad, get your view on this recent sectarian. I mean, sectarian tensions have been a historical reality within Pakistan. But I just wanted to check with you on, in particular, in the last few months, we've seen a resurgence of those violent patterns and violent hate speech, etc. So, I mean, tell me about that. Your own experience and also what you've seen others in in the other journalists. How do they navigate this difficult field? I mean,
So I think what this actually kind of neatly ties into what we were talking about earlier in the conversation about how states, when they suppress certain voices, it actually leads to a distortion of an understanding of reality. And what we've seen, just to lay the kind of factual groundwork here, is that since around about, I would say, July, there's been a sharp uptick in, and so essentially in the run-up to Muharram, we saw a sharp uptick in blasphemy cases being lodged against, generally against Shias, but also by Shias against Sunni clerics who were criticizing Shia ways of thought and belief and prayer, etc., or worship rather is perhaps the better term there. And so we saw a lot of those cases, and that was beginning to rise in a way that was not happening before. We then began to see during Muharram there were a few small incidents of violence. And then obviously in September, we saw that massive rally in Karachi held by the Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat, which is an explicitly anti-Shia grouping. They call themselves a political party, but have pretty clear links with armed groups that perpetrate anti-Shia violence. Now, when you censor coverage of that, which is exactly what happened, that rally was not covered by most mainstream media. If at all it was covered in text. I don't think it was covered in video at all. And so what ends up happening is, so that happened. There were thousands of people out in the streets who were chanting things like Shias are kafirs and so on. But it wasn't part of the national consciousness. Now, as a result of that, we've seen violence, sectarian violence, particularly in Karachi, where Shias have been targeted, and some Sunni clerics who've been quite vitriolic in their speech against Shias have also been targeted. So So what happens when audiences don't hear the backstory is that they look at these incidents and they're like, wait, what's going on? How is this even possible? How is this happening? And so the role of journalists this is why the journalism and the conflict journalism and trying to tell both sides or all sides of that story is important, because that then allows societies to actually understand what's going on with them. And this is why censorship fundamentally doesn't work. In fact, it turns societies into sicker societies because it essentially just creates isolated, insulated silos. So I think that's, and again, I think that links very nicely to what we've been saying all along about conflict journalism, is that it's important for it to be free and it's important for it to be done. We need more journalism, not less of it.
Yeah, thank you. I go back to Kathy because we lost her connection. So Kathy, you were talking about, I mean, you were finishing on social media. I also want to add a little bit because you've seen all these phases from print to podcast. How do you view this trajectory and path that journalism is taking?
Yeah, good question. I have some issues with the whole social media journalism, because we lose sight of the fact that when we get out there and start with opinions and that we risk our credibility and we risk our neutrality and we risk, so again, that goes back to sort of the blurring of the lines. And I think, again, we need to have some smart, innovative thinking of how we go forward with this, because journalism and journalists, our credibility is really taking a hit. And I think for a lot of reasons, not some very much not in our control and not because of us, but some also because of us and how we, as a profession, are operating, and that is comes out online, and so I just wanted to make the point that I feel like I see some of the reports from some of the journalists and their comments online and it becomes difficult for me to see how they can then be presented as independent or neutral journalists or to be trusted by either side or both sides or any side, so I think there's some real issues that, and I have no idea what the answers are, to tell you the truth, but I do feel that our profession and as professionals, we really need to do some soul searching and really thinking about how we operate, and I think in many ways we do a really good job, but I do think that there's some blurring and a few muddy lines there that I think we really have to take ourselves to task over.
Yeah, thank you. This is it is indeed a complicated and it's changing so fast. That's the other thing, keeping pace with it, and perhaps that's the next debate we should have maybe next year or later on this platform. So Amber, I'll go back to the earlier point that Asad very eloquently highlighted on sectarian conflict, because last month I think I had to edit an it was a long article on these what the Shia clerics said and what the Sunni clerics said, and I was reading the contents and I didn't know what to do with them, because if I were chopping them off, I was, as Asad said, I was not letting enough information or the backstory out there, and including them bordered on propagating hate speech. So, so these are the kind of dilemmas that one faces. But anyway, on the larger issue of sectarian conflict and what would you say? I mean, because you've dealt with these issues, time and again.
Yeah, I've dealt with these issues. I've covered them as a reporter, and I used to try and include them in my programs as well. But I would say that I think with the sectarian, the upsurge in blasphemy cases and what happened during Muharram, that was something that channels were not allowed to talk about, and I actually did have to make a few calls to people who were well connected to understand what was happening, because it was through social media that we got to know about it. And we know that the problem, and that's again the problem with censorship. So people, all those speeches that you were talking about, Raza, you were careful as a journalist who understood the impact of hate speech. You'd be careful, obviously, to put that information out there in the form that it was on your platform. But on social media, it's unbridled. So people will get to hear it, and it leads to potentially more violence. So that is a problem with censorship, where if these issues aren't given the coverage they ought to be, people don't know how to keep themselves safe, or not aware, don't have full information. I mean, that's another example of how when Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan did their sit-in against against the French president, against France, against those blasphemous characters in Islamabad, it was not covered on the mainstream media. Nobody in Islamabad, Rawalpindi actually knew, and this is just from the point of view of safety and how to get anywhere, knew what was happening and how long it would continue. Mobile signals were also shut off. So, I mean, this entire blunt hammer approach of just, this is controversial, this could potentially lead to something else, just shut it down, block. As I mean, I just don't understand why that strategy is seen as being effective. It really isn't. It actually adds to distress. And it adds to more sort of misinformation and disinformation being spread in social media, because mainstream media doesn't seem to have the credibility or is not able to cover these issues.
Well, I mean, thank you so much. I mean, this is such a fascinating discussion. I really don't want to end, but I think we are well over our time limit. And thank you so much, Kathy and Amber and Asad, for sharing your ideas, your experiences, and your insights, um, uh, both with regard to the conflict and conflict reporting, but also in the overall state of journalism. Um, uh, Both locally and I guess regionally and globally. But I think my major takeaway from this session is that basically journalism is journalism, as Kathy said, and I think we got to stick to that. And if we keep on doing that, perhaps there is a way of both finding peace and resolution, and perhaps a better imagined societies in our region. So with that, I thank you once again, and thank you, viewers, for joining the Ideas Conclave 2020, and we hope to see you again. Bye. Okay, Salman, end it, please.